All right, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back to me. I'm still sick. I've gotten a couple of negative COVID tests so far, but still I'm waiting till the symptoms are gone. So far, it's just mainly a sore throat, which is very frustrating given what I have to do right now. But anyway, I wish it was a sore toe or something that I won't interfere with the lecturing so much. I sent out an email earlier, but basically just plan on watching my video lectures this week, unless otherwise noted. Maybe by Wednesday or Thursday I'll feel well enough to come and don't feel contagious. But probably not. Actually, that window is probably not right. Holly, the TA, has volunteered to have an in-person meeting at some point, and so we may do that if we get sick of looking at screens again. Anyway, so also just a few things. I'm going to be once again changing some of the due dates, deadlines. So just I'll kind of talk about that in a moment. I think I should introduce you to the other teaching assistant who doesn't come to campus very often. Where is she? There she is. Look over here, Willow. Her name is Willow. She only has one eye, but she's pretty sleepy right now, but she is usually quite the terror, climbing around. I'm pretty sure she's part primate or something. She has a lot of kind of interesting connective tissue things, kind of a genetic mutant, but she almost has detachable thumbs. Just like one more step, and then evolution will leave us humans behind and place the felines where they rightfully belong. Okay, so I did want to talk about this assignment that you'll have. I'll be changing the due date to Friday night by 11:59 p.m. It's not going to be, that challenging, being kind of lenient, especially given the circumstances. But essentially what you're going to be doing is choosing, a location, maybe your hometown, or maybe, where you're living now. And you're going to basically look at, where this pollution is coming from, what kind of pollutants there are, and so on. And in the past, I'd used a website where it was just very user-friendly. It had a lot of the information kind of squarely there to use. The data was becoming dated, like 10 to 15 years, so that was one reason why I'm glad that the EPA has really revamped their toxic release inventory program. So basically you will go there, and let me go back to the assignment. What you're going to be looking at is, again, you can type in your zip code, your address, whatever you want. Choose a certain location. It will show you then who the top polluters are and what the top pollutants are. You can focus on another aspect. There's things like, looks at ways you can look at environmental justice, watersheds, and again, you're welcome to investigate further and write more than 2 to 3 pages. Just make sure you do include this information. So just briefly how that works. So you will go to the EPA's toxic release page. Maybe some of you are even already familiar with it. And if I'm on Safari right now, but if you want to use like Mozilla or Google Chrome or something, it seems to work better for the full version of the toxic tracker. If you want to get really detailed. Otherwise, you can look at the state. So I'm going to choose where I grew up in Nebraska, the main streets of Blair, Nebraska. Let's let's see, Washington County, zip code 68208, okay. Alright, now I'm ready to view search results. So, Blair, Nebraska, if you want to, if I can zoom out. See, Iowa's right there, Nebraska's right there. If you don't know where those places are, is realize some Californians don't. That's basically where I lived, almost, you know, what looks like the center of the United States. So, if I'm interested in, okay, what are the facilities? So this is probably where you want to go. You can look at the facilities, you know, what kind of, you know, plants or factories or whatever are there. You can look at, say, well, here we've got the top 10. That might be the easiest way to do it. The Evonik Core, which I'm not familiar with actually. Novozymes Blair Incorporated, not familiar with them either. All of these different companies, which is kind of interesting because I left Nebraska back in 2004. And at that time, the biggest polluters were a Cargill agricultural plant, and they just decommissioned a nuclear power plant there. So those were, you know, in the past, some of the worst places. So, like I said, I'll see if this works. I'm using Safari. I could move to something else, but that you can just look at it in more fine detail. Look at some of, let's see. So basically, you know, city, state, Washington County, basically 5 top chemicals reported. This is just looking at the most recent time for facilities. And then, let's see, the summary. Top facilities and chemicals. It's kind of slow. Here we go. So again, just another way in which you can see it. Facility list. Look at total releases. Again, so you can see there's pretty much a rural area where I live, so I'm not actually sure what these, well, let's see, what does it say they do? Organic chemical manufacturing, which we'll be talking about today, actually. Basically all of those things in one. Concrete pollutants. Then you can see the top 3 chemicals by RSEI scores. Ammonia, looks like there's some bad ammonia there. Looking at, you can also look at environmental justice. So, as I said, I used to use this other site called Scorecard up until now. When I started putting this class together, they actually phased it out fairly recently, and I was not aware of that. So anyway, I can go over this a little bit more tomorrow, and if you have any questions. But you can play around with it. That's part of the thing, just kind of, you know, making sure you're kind of addressing those 4 questions we looked at, but then you can look at, you know, things by, you know, potential health effects. You know, what are the health effects of these different companies and so on. So the main ones: ammonia, respiratory, ocular, then nitrate compounds, developmental, mercury, neurological, etc., etc. So again, you can play around with it, where, you know, make sure that you do answer the questions and write well and so on, but you have a lot of leeway in terms of, you know, really kind of if you want to expand, because like I said, there's a lot of interesting information here, and if you do start working for, say, some, you know, environmental-based or environmentally focused firm or government agency or something like this, sites like these are good to be familiar with. GIS, Geographic Information Systems. Okay, so anyway, I'll talk about that more tomorrow. Just email me if you have any questions. I'll also be on Packback over the next couple of days, kind of playing around. I've been trying to wrest this illness away. Paxlovid, I got the Paxlovid thing going on, so hopefully I don't have a rebound. But anyway, okay, so so the last time I had discussed the Civil War, pretty much ended at the end of that conflict, and here you've got sort of a cartoon from, I'm not exactly sure what year this is, sometime shortly after the Civil War ended, but you've got basically it's showing that, there's increasing fraternity between the North and the South. A lot of people still, angry, wanting to rise up against the North, but for the most part, a lot of those sentiments really kind of ended over the next 20, 25, 50 years for most people. It happened at the same time that the Jim Crow laws and so on were enforced too. So the other thing that you see there is something that a lot of people don't think about in terms of the United States. Before the war, a lot of people thought of the United States as, this almost more their state. Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate general, he actually turned down an offer to be the head of the Union Army, and probably would have taken it if Virginia would have stayed in the Union. But they didn't, and his loyalty was to Virginia above the United States, and a lot of people in the South especially felt that way. In the North, it wasn't so much this focus on sort of states' rights and things like that. It was more that people, they didn't travel much. They didn't, go out of state too often. What the Civil War did was it brought, hundreds of thousands of men and women, but especially men, into armies and supply trains and, everything, where they traveled and they walked and they marched, and they fought across the country. And so, they saw, they saw the country. So that's one kind of thing that comes out of the Civil War too, is just a greater geographical appreciation for the country. If they didn't believe it was a country before, now they do. They had been, through several different states and seen many different Americans and served with people from all over the country as well. So Reconstruction, in some ways, a number of good things happen in the sense that the Union, does not behave like a completely sort of authoritarian occupier, even though they were occupying the South, making sure that there wasn't, going to be an uprising again or sort of mob violence, that kind of thing. So in that sense, that was I would argue, a good thing. On the negative side, though, is that the South essentially, as it rejoined the North, a lot of the racist attitudes from the South, were sort of rejoined to the American project. I think it's one thing that's fascinating is the vice president of the Confederacy. When the Civil War ended, he was elected to his seat in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. from Alabama. That's where he had been before the Civil War, so like the war never happened. For black people, it was a much more devastating affair. Slavery ended, and that was fantastic and a very positive development, of course. But exploitation did not, and then over the next few decades, the South has become sort of more integrated once again within the broader power structure, and the U.S. begins to clamp down on things, on civil rights and things like that, and it starts to segregate. It makes it almost impossible for black people to vote, and all of these different things. Other things that, a lot of people may not be too familiar with, but that's that cotton actually, becomes more powerful, and actually production increases even more after the Civil War. And we tend to think of the main thing that slaves worked on were the cotton fields. And while that was true for a few decades, if you remember, we also talked about tobacco and rice were big ones as well. So the cotton started really taking off. So the sharecropping system then tied laborers to the land for a certain amount of time. Plantations, or these places that were once plantations, were divided into these smaller farms. You also now had more railroad systems going through, so it made it easier for people to bring their goods to be distributed. Now, the problems, though, of course, were exploitation. Similar thing happened with decolonization. When the former European colonies after the Second World War became independent, and they were given loans for the next couple of decades by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and in a lot of ways exploited. And then they were just basically fell into debt for a lot of reasons. So anyway, something similar happened here, where merchants loaned farmers money with future crop as sort of the collateral. They made them grow cotton because that's what the market wanted. But it led to less food being grown in the South and more debt. And this was hitting both poor white farmers, former soldiers that had come back from the war, and the free black people, and especially free black men. The other thing that really kind of takes off during this time is the use of fertilizer. Just a couple years after the end of the Civil War, you have these mines in South Carolina where they're looking for phosphate. And that was going then to Georgia, and they were using it in the fertilizer that they were using in the cotton fields at that time. Now, unfortunately, they were not allowing it time to rest, for like a year or so. They were just dumping more and more fertilizer on it, and just overusing the fertilizer, and it was degrading the soil, and it led to the worst soil depletion in Southern history. So that did not go well. Now, someone pointed out that in some ways these phosphate mines the system was, it looked a lot like slavery, where yes, there was a lot of black men that were working in the mines here. They could quit and go get another job, because they were free, they were not enslaved. However, there was not a lot of labor around, and so this is one of the few options that they had. Very difficult work, backbreaking labor. They were not nearly compensated the way that they should have been. So again, just a lot of exploitation happening here. So sharecroppers, they're in debt, and so they want more fertilizer so that they're okay. So the farmers, they want to grow more crops, so they bought more phosphate using credit, though, which hurts the soil, and then they ended up just getting into this cycle where they're just basically in debt, and the system really it is maintained, but for the most part some of it holds in place for quite some time, and so you have a few generations of really indebted farmers in the South. Then the cotton industry in the United States, it doesn't come to a complete end, but it really, it kind of comes to, for the most part, it comes to an end compared to what had preceded it. So in 1892, you have the boll weevil. I was looking at some pictures of them. They look kind of cute, actually. I mean, I don't know. But if you're a farmer and you're depending on cotton, they don't look so cute. When I was in Santa Barbara 10 years ago or so, and one of the local farmers, I was talking to them and, talking about rodents and pests and farming and, not using pesticides and that sort of thing. And I was saying, it'd be hard for me as the ground squirrels. It'd be hard for me to kill them, because it would have to do that in order to really be sustainable or, have your crops work out. And, it's a question of your life or the squirrels. But anyway, I was, saying that would be a hard thing for me to do, would be to kill the pests, the squirrels. And the farmer said, yeah, I felt the same way. I had never heard a creature, and, that was the last thing I wanted to do, and I tried everything, and they just kept on destroying my crops. And now nothing gives me greater joy than shooting one of those motherfuckers. I was just like, whoa, okay. So anyway, so as cute as the ground squirrel and the boll weevil are, they're pretty devastating for people's lives. So in Georgia, one county in 1916 had, almost 12,000 bales of cotton. The boll weevil comes through in 1920, you'll only have, a little over 300. Huge decline there. Again, as I said, it was especially devastating for black farmers who had been, essentially pushed onto into these sharecropping systems. And that was focused on cotton for Wall Street and so on. So this is one of, along with segregation, is one of the factors that leads to the Great Migration, which is this huge migration of black people out of the South into the northern cities, and so on. So anyway, the boll weevil. If you're interested in its sort of cycle, you can take a look at it. I'm not going to go over this, but just in case you're interested, like I said, I think it's kind of cute, but kind of destructive too. So the South begins to suffer here because, especially with the boll weevil, they had been dredging and building levees and canals and so on, a lot of times so that they could, have more land in places that they wanted to, or being able to, so they could transport stuff by river more quickly. But then you get flooding, and this, starts to really increase across the South, and it really, again, it helps to sort of eradicate the cotton industry in the South. So if you remember when we talked early on about Garrett Hardin, the tragedy of the commons, and then the work by Eleanor Ostrom, who showed that, a lot of times people come up with creative arrangements in order to manage the commons on their own. So after the Civil War, you have the Southern enclosure movement. If you remember, in the English enclosure movement, the land is bought up by absentee landlords, powerful nobles and aristocrats and emerging merchants, that kind of thing. And the Londoners, the peasants are pushed into places like London and Manchester and so on, where they, become the working class essentially. So you have this happen after the Civil War, basically, and enclosure movement happens. Before that, a lot of the land was held in common. So, it might be owned by someone else, but, someone else could run their pigs through it or run their cattle through it, that kind of thing. They weren't necessarily prevented from doing that. Some farmers would fence off, some of their crops or something like this, but, they would allow people to forage in, say, like the woods that was on their property or whatever. So when the emancipation of the slaves happened, a lot of the white planters are suddenly worried that, black people would not, want to be the labor force anymore, if they could just use the commons. So black people had been knowledgeable about the food sources and resources within forests and natural landscapes. And a lot of this came from the Underground Railroad and other attempts to leave, to escape slavery, and having to survive in the jungle and passing that knowledge on to the next generation and so on. So the planters, they're starting to worry about the commons now, not because they're worried that it's going to be overused, but because that they're worried that black people wouldn't be their labor force if they could use the commons. So they basically started demanding more private property and less commons. So they also developed some game laws, not hunting such and such animals. The way that they were focused, it was pretty clear that it was not about the environment, but it was about controlling people, both poor white people and especially poor black people. A good example then is that where you have Alabama, one of their laws that they passed about hunting only pertained to the black belt, and the black belt here referring to the black prairie soil. That also happens to be where a lot of black people live, because that's where the farms and plantations had been. So the no foraging laws only applied to these places. Other places where you had more white people, less black people, you could forage still. So anyway, very important racial dynamics come into play when we're talking about land use. Now, you may be familiar with Alexis Nicole Nelson, the wildly popular black forager. So she, on TikTok and Instagram, I think those are the best platforms to watch her, but she just goes around forests and various places and just, knows everything about everything, what's edible. And it's really amazing how much is edible out there. And, she really kind of shows you can do all these different things, and it's really kind of amazing. She has a TED Talk. Don't watch it. She is, kind of, that sort of format is kind of boring for for what she does, but her TikTok and Instagram videos are very well done. And so she's been doing this for quite some time, just kind of talking about the different plants and edible and so on. And at a few episodes she started kind of talking about slavery and Reconstruction in that era, and some white people had commented, saying, why can't you just stick to talking about the foraging? Why do you have to talk about, slavery and the history? And then so she had to say, well, the reason that we know all this stuff, that I know this stuff, and that most people know this stuff is because of slavery, because of black people who were escaping slavery, or after the end of the Civil War, were taking advantage of the commons, or before the enclosure movement happens. And so a lot of the knowledge about foraging, especially in the East Coast and the South, comes from the slavery period and the post-slavery period. So again, it's all very much tied together. Okay. So if you've ever been to the rural areas in some of the East Coast states, and especially Virginia and South, you have probably seen these zigzag fences. These were the sort of fences of choice by Southern landowners. Now, I think they're very aesthetically pleasing, and they kind of give space. Kind of cows can have a little triangle to each to their own, or something like that. The problem with them, though, is that they do use a lot of wood, as you can see if this just went straight across. So while they're still around, they're mainly there for sort of historical, nostalgic purposes. Shortly after the Civil War, as people are starting to move west, and you're starting to, as we'll talk about when we talk about the West, the cattle industry starts to take off, and you get the invention of barbed wire, and then that changes things again, and that really intensifies the enclosure movement in the South at that time. So in the 1890s, farmers had to pen animals, basically. People were starting to get kind of frustrated with, someone else's pigs running through their land and, damaging their own property and stuff like this. So you start to see, the enclosure movement and other things to prevent animals from causing damage. One of the things that this did was it punished the owners of these herds that would be, say, going through a forest of someone else's property, and they trampled over a bunch of crops that were growing in there. Now those those herders or whatever would have to pay some sort of compensation. And I do want to point out that as the sort of cowboy period begins, there are a lot of black cowboys. It's very important to understand that, especially coming out of Texas and Oklahoma and going west from there. Places that especially that already had some familiarity with the cattle industry and so on, and also saw this as going to new places where there's potentially going to be less racism. So interesting history there as well. Now we'll get into this in a lot more detail later, but I'll just kind of point out now that the story of the West quickly becomes the story of cows. So where do we see more cows than people? As looks, you can see in the vast majority of the country, there's more people than cows. The places where it's more gray or black, you start to see more cows than people. So where I'm from in Nebraska, there are way more cows than people. A lot of huge industrial farming. These are not, happy cows in pastures, generally speaking. These are, gigantic factory farms. And again, it kind of extends, we'll talk about, over the Ogallala Aquifer, which is where a lot of the water that irrigates the Midwest comes from. And, like water everywhere, we're starting to see that diminish as well. So the dark areas here, again, major livestock areas, we still, see livestock, really across the country, just not as nearly as important. Look at this in more detail. Again, you can see just kind of a breakdown. I grew up in Nebraska, so I guess I'm not too surprised by this. I am a little bit, though, because, I didn't realize that we had so few people and so many cows. But anyway, you can see where the cows and the less than people are located. Okay, so during this time period, too, the time period of sharecropping, people starting to move to the west, you also start to see an enormously rich class develop. The factory owners, the people who had formerly ran plantations, who are now just large agribusiness owners, and so on. And insurance is a new thing and really kind of takes off at this time period as well. So you do have this elite that are well educated. They'll have traveled to Europe. They will basically live very well in the East Coast and will not venture into rural areas very often. And we see similar political conflicts and dimensions today. My teaching assistant is sleeping right now, so she won't be grading any material that would deal with this material. Anyway, sorry. All right. So let's see. Okay. So you start to get, as I said, the emergence of populism, and this is a kind of a cartoon looking at On the one hand, you have the commercial trust, the capitalist class, and so on. On the other, you have the labor trust and the club of a spike. Apparently, the capitalists don't have any weapons or anything to keep the workers down. But you see, the workers. His side is where the factories are. You see the pollution, the kind of mansion that the commercial trust guy is coming out of. And then I cannot read what this says exactly, but middlemen maybe. I think this is supposed to be like the middle class. The center, the people in the center of society, and you kind of see some of these conflicts today as well, although it's much more complicated now. So you get the People's Party, and this was a party that was standing up for especially the farmers, and it was they looked up to Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson advocated small farms, and we talked about the rectangles, rectangle plots. Rectangle plots and so on. And so, this shows the farmer using a John Deere plow, it looks like, and he's basically pointing out that, he fights and sails and, that all these other people fight and they sail and, they plead as lawyers and they work as distributors and all of these different things. And there at the center, though, he says, I feed you all. Basically, like, you wouldn't be able to do anything else if it wasn't for me. So you kind of still sometimes hear arguments for a third party that will basically be another people's party to represent the people. It's hard to say how that would different, it'd have to be there, well, I won't go into it too much, but basically, there's very different ideas in terms of who the elites are right now. Some people think that the elites are people like me who teach at West Coast UC school and sociology. Others who think that the elites are people who work at the upper echelon of tech firms, Wall Street firms, etc. So anyway, so that's one problem right now is, a third party would probably be either a right-wing populist party or a left-wing populist party. And we may be heading that direction, actually. But anyway, moving forward, as you can see, some of the populism didn't win out. You have the populism, the candidate pleading for people to join him, to work on the land and so on. But everybody you can see is chasing Lady Prosperity, essentially, away from populism. Moving forward to today, if you're interested in populism, there's a lot of stuff out there. Now, I teach political sociology, and I also have taught a class on extremism. I would, if you're interested in sort of contemporary populism, I would check out the ideational approach to populism. Levente Litve is one of the main kind of proponents of this. He says, today I think the answer is not to separate the subcomponents of populism, but to measure it holistically. So instead of looking at left-wing or right-wing populism, he kind of wants to step further back and say, okay, what is it about populism, both left and right? How does it sort of emerge? He's also a close friend of mine, known him for quite some time. Interestingly, his father was in the most popular American country western band in Eastern Europe for a while, so I visited him in Budapest in Hungary once, and his dad drives this big old Cadillac around with the long horns on the front, and wears this cowboy hat, and the brain's not working thing, the bowl, whatever. But anyway, so wears cowboy boots. Interesting sort of cultural thing there. I'm not a big fan of country music, so I can't say one way or the other if it's good or not. But okay, anyway, moving on. This lecture may go on past the normal period. If that's so, then it will just count as tomorrow's lecture. I'll point that out in an email. So anyway, in the South, the next big thing that's happening is the lumber industry. So there are a lot of forests in the South. And there were more. But basically, within about 40 years, almost half of the forests are cut down. Congress, at the end of the Civil War, had basically passed a law where they would give federal aid to freedmen, which were the freed slaves. However, by 1876, there were enough Southern legislators who were, segregationists, who basically, as Reconstruction came to an end, they repealed that law. So, it just meant that the free blacks in the South who were farmers, were not given the help that the white homesteaders were given. Other things about this period, as you get more railroads, you also get more forest fires as sparks would go off from the tracks and hit and ignite the fires. It wasn't that big of a deal because they actually did have burns fairly often, but it did cause more fire than they were used to. There's one battle in the Civil War, I think it's called the Wilderness Battle, and it was fought in northern Virginia, and the forest was very dry. It was kind of like a drought conditions. And, they had these old muskets where they had to do all these things, and sparks were all continuously flying up, and a number of fires were started. And so there were, thousands of people, men who were wounded, lying in these forests, and they burned to death, or they suffocated from the smoke, and just as awful as any of those battles were, to have a forest fire on top of it just sounds horrifying. And then other things that happen, big events, you have the chestnut blight, which your book talks about, and I'm going blank on the specific blight that hit it, but chestnuts had been one of the most prolific growing trees in the East Coast and the South, and even going into the Midwest, and you can see where its range of predominance is. And these were big trees. I mean, they weren't redwoods, but some of them were pretty close, and some were bigger than some redwoods. But a lot of those, most of those big old growth ones are gone. They died very quickly, and it's been called one of the biggest changes to plant life in human history. It's pretty dramatic, considering how much plant life has changed during human history. Okay, so kind of returning to disproportionality, and looking at some research that was done, again, by this Bill Freudenberg, of we've been talking about. So, looking at chemical, and I believe they're looking at sort of phosphate. I can't remember exactly what the chemical, they're just looking at chemicals in general, but they were looking at phosphate. If you remember that, most of the toxins come from less than 4% of facilities. Tiny fraction of the facilities are responsible for, half the pollution. So one of the time that they did this research, which was back in the 1990s, but is illustrative of what we still see, was the DuPont and Freeport McMoran. These are two major chemical companies. They had a facility where they had 400 million pounds of toxic release, 30% of the chemical industry's total release. So, the American chemical industry is enormous. It's huge. So for this one facility, to have 30% of the total. That's clear disproportionality going on there. So that's of the chemical industry, but even beyond that, it's 14% of the total national toxic waste. Again, this is 1993, but really striking numbers there. You could reduce a lot of pollution within the chemical industry and within the nation by doing something about this one facility. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm saying one facility. It's one company. Yeah, but at the facility level, you will see that it's also still disproportionate. What's the economic importance? About $40 billion, 0.6% of the national total. Employs about 115,000 people, so not a very large percentage of workers. So they can't really make the argument that it's, clear economic importance or, the labor force. So then, yes, here's the facility. So they looked at the worst single facility, and that was this place in St. James, Louisiana. Okay, so, and what was it that they are making? They had 127 million pounds of toxic releases. Now, this is 5% of the national total. So again, single facility, 5% of the national total of toxic releases. That's a clear disproportionality right there. What were they producing? Fertilizer. But again, key point here is that other companies were producing fertilizer just as much without nearly the same level of toxic release. So what was going on at this place in St. James, Louisiana? So the good news is that, some environmental regulators, monitors, whoever pointed this stuff out, and I think they may have been forced to reduce their emissions, or they did it before they were fined or something like this. But anyway, what was the problem? What were they doing wrong? Is this sort of something that's this is the only way it could have been done, and that's just how it is, and it's too bad for the environment? Well, no. So they had this phosphoric acid, and they had huge stacks of it that was not covered. So it was just sitting there in these gigantic piles, and this is, I believe, what did I say? Louisiana. If you don't know anything about Louisiana weather, it tends to rain a lot there. It's almost tropical. So anyway, so it would rain inevitably, and you would just get these ponds of phosphate, and then they would evaporate. Some of it would seep into the groundwater then as well. And so what they did, they built a structure around it, covering it up, and it reduced their toxic releases by 50%. And I think they did other things to actually reduce it even more. And not only that, it turns out, they actually increased profits by not losing so much material. So it was just, wastefulness, just clear inefficiency. If you remember the Julian Simon Polyeric bet at the beginning of class, Simon would say, you got to innovate, you got to, be more efficient, build something over your product, so you don't, end up losing money and destroying the environment in the process. Just while we're on the topic of disproportionality, and I'll talk about the assignment, tomorrow's lecture, video lecture. Okay, so where's a lot of the trade today? A lot of the shipping trade, is in container ships. That's innovation in the 1970s, where you can put a lot of containers onto a single ship, and then changed how merchants would sail. It used to be boxes of stuff, and people would carry the boxes and so on. Revolutionized in the early 70s, really takes off in the 80s and 1990s as trade with China begins, and that's where you see most of the trade that's going on here tends to be in the Pacific. Well, again, there's some disproportionality going on here, things that could be probably easily changed. So, so a lot of these shipping containers carry most of the world's trade. They only produce 3% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, but again, 3% is 3%. That's still a significantly high number. And the industry itself is dirtier than that, because there's all sorts of other sorts of pollution that goes along with it. So by burning heavy fuel oil, just 15 of the biggest ships emit more of the noxious oxides of nitrogen and sulfur than all of the world's cars put together. Think about that. 15 ships emit more nitrogen and sulfur than all of the world's cars put together. That's incredible. And do I have it on this slide? No, I have it later, and I have a slide devoted to optimism. And there has been some movements toward cleaning the industry, some serious efforts. So we'll talk about that, but I'm glad to know that's going on. Okay, so as I said, the topic today, primarily now, we're going to be talking about energy. So the history of planet Earth goes a long way back, and I'm not going to go through all that other than to say the Pleistocene was our last epoch. We're sort of in the Holocene, and it's often being called the Anthropocene, and we talked about that at the beginning of class, and you had the readings about the pros and cons of using it, both as a way in which to maybe educate or for purposes of activism to motivate, also as a scientific concept, for sort of geological use. Again, there's a lot of debate still about that, especially on the science stuff. Okay, Edward O. Wilson, one of the world's most famous scientists, died recently. Famous in sociology for developing the approach called sociobiology, basically, seeing that, okay, all social organisms probably have certain things in common. And he's an expert on ants and looked at humans for a while. And anyway, very fascinating individual, huge impact on me. I read a book by him called Consilience, The Unity of All Knowledge, where he basically made the argument that, all knowledge is going to come together under maybe like biology or planetary ecology or something like this. Anyway, he devoted the last, few decades of his life, lived into his 90s, but the last few decades to looking at the loss of biodiversity, specifically. So anyway, he's got a lot of very good work on that too. So some interesting things happen. Crude oil, you can look at just the century, shoots up in 2007, and that's basically when the housing market is crashing and other institutions are crashing and people are putting their money into commodities, and it leads the price of oil to go very high. And some people thought it meant, we'd reached peak oil, where peak oil is this idea that, at a certain point we'll reach the end of oil. Essentially, that it'll be harder it'll cost more to extract it than we are getting out of it. The price of oil then falls quite dramatically, and we get used to low oil prices. And then comes COVID, and more importantly, more significantly for the price of oil, the war between Russia and Ukraine. So again, oil shoots up, and it's fallen in the last few weeks and may continue to fall, so that will provide some poorer people with relief. But it does show how volatile the world's energy markets are, and we didn't see, prices didn't get high enough for there to be like riots or something like this. But you could see that happening, if prices get too high. So anyway, as I said, prices are going down, especially for gasoline, for automobiles, and that in many ways is most important holds the most importance for most people, because they have to get to work and et cetera, et cetera. So again, this always, as an environmentalist, it's hard to know how to feel about oil pricing and so on. On the one hand, Americans actually pay tremendously little for our gasoline, much less than other countries. The federal gas tax hadn't been raised since like 1983 or 93, I can't remember which. I think Biden may have actually lowered it again. I remember when I turned 16 and gas was like 99 cents a gallon or something, and hovered there, got above $1 shortly thereafter, and then it's just basically gone up ever since. So again, though, what do we do about oil? It's a tough one, because I had a student in my sociology class. We haven't talked about the environment yet, but I had talked about population and the relationship between oil, fossil fuel use, and the human population. And they were saying, well, isn't it then a bad thing if we stop using oil? And I said, well, it's not a bad thing per se, in the sense that oil is very polluting, and all for the reasons we know, unstable governments, etc., etc. However, there are some theorists, some scientists who believe that basically once we sort of reach the point of peak oil where it becomes too expensive or too difficult to extract, that's called EROI. Energy return on investment. Basically, at a certain point, it costs too much to get out. Then you get out of it. And so some people think that the human population will crash down to what it was before oil, around a billion and a half people. I think the challenge particularly lies in areas we often don't think of. I think when we think of oil, it's immediately gasoline. That's kind of the number one thing we think about, and that's understandable, because it's how we move stuff around. But then there's plastic, and as much as we want to eliminate plastic, and need to, because it is a polluting substance, and it's turned out to be very difficult to actually recycle. It's almost non-recyclable. We are starting to learn now. But think of all the things that it's used for. Most importantly, besides transportation, the packaging of food. And, allowing food to be packaged in plastic allows it to last longer. And then all of the plastic that is used in hospitals and clinics. I think about that whenever I'm in a hospital or clinic, just, all the gloves that need to be thrown away after one use, and all of these caps and so on and so forth. It's very difficult to imagine modern medicine and modern hospitals without plastic. Think of the things that you like to do, the various activities that you might enjoy, the concerts or football games or clubs, or just about everything. That's not like meditating in the woods or something. In modern life, uses a fair amount of plastic. So it's going to be phasing out fossil fuels and these polluting substances is going to dramatically change our society in ways that are not clear yet. I'm not going to go through a whole lot of the science here. Some of you, I'm sure, probably know this know this better than I do. But basically, so this is the sociologist sort of lecture on energy and so on. So petroleum, stored solar energy, as you probably know, it's not dinosaurs, it's algae and types of plankton, capped in rocks, trapped is what they call it. Some of it gets slow cooked and becomes this substance, and you can see the different kind of things. You've got different types of gas and so on. You've got coal, and then you got the shale, which I'll talk about in a moment. So at about 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and if it's cooked at that temperature, by the Earth itself, then we get oil. If it goes to about 300 degrees hotter, we get natural gas. So the deeper wells that are drilled get more natural gas. They also have more risk. So those are the ones that would go down deep into the shale for the natural gas. So again, as I said, I'm not going to go over this again, but just, oil goes into everything, the packaging of food, as well as, importantly, the transportation of packaged food. Okay, so the history of modern oil. So in what's now the Northeast U.S., and for hundreds of years, maybe longer, various different native groups had used the oil from those seeping up for different things. And then in the 1600s is when white people first discovered petroleum in Seneca County, New York. Yale chemist calls it Seneca oil, and basically says, you should drill more and you can find more. And then you also get, people selling snake oil and stuff that doesn't work, for various things, or they using oil and saying that's going to do stuff that it doesn't. So anyway, this gets the oil rush going. When I left, I'd been up at Sonoma State for a year, and then I left Sonoma State to go to Penn State for 7 years or so. And it was always fascinating because Pennsylvania has a lot of the country's energy history comes out of Pennsylvania. And I worked with a student on a project where we were looking at natural gas companies and fracking and so on. And we're going to do more with that project, but interestingly, a lot of the companies that were, they were just growing and becoming more powerful and buying this and that. And then came COVID and, the crash in demand for oil. And a lot of those companies ended up going bankrupt. Crash not just in oil, but also for natural gas. Anyway, very interesting. So the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company is the first sort of modern oil company, headed by this guy named Colonel Edward Drake. He wasn't a real colonel. He made that up to look cool in front of the locals whose area he was drilling in. So in Titusville, Pennsylvania, which is kind of northeast Pennsylvania, you have the birthplace in 1859 of the oil industry. In one of those kind of weird moments of history, August 27th, Drake receives a letter from financial backers, basically saying, okay, we've been sending you money for a while. You're not really getting much out of it. We're gonna, we want you to stop. The next day, August 28th, they struck gold, or the equivalent of it, essentially. Black gold. So Pennsylvania, through the 1880s, 85% or so of the oil went through it. By 1900, half of the world oil was coming from Pennsylvania. And then massive deforestation across Pennsylvania in order to get oil. When the oil is gone, so is the economy that was built on it. So lot of the oil that was easy to get, they were able to drill out pretty quickly, and then, demand shifted to California and Texas and other places. Pennsylvania started to, had to regrow a lot of their forests. So there's still a lot of forests in Pennsylvania, but most of it is fairly new growth. So other major events that happen that are maybe important for you especially, oil drilling moves offshore. They start to realize, hey, there's all this oil, huge, tremendously enormous amounts of it, but it's just off the coast, but it's under the water and under the ground. So innovations were made, and you have the first offshore drilling happen in 1891, just here next to us in Summerland, California, just south of Santa Barbara. Most of the offshore drilling, though, isn't in California. Most of it shifted to Louisiana in the 1930s. There you go. That's kind of what the around Summerland looked like back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Looks a little bit nicer today, not just because of the color photo. As you probably know, the historically relevant, important event that happened in Santa Barbara for the environmental movement, and that was the oil spill in 1969. At that time it was the largest in American history. It's the third largest now after the 2010 BP oil spill, which was off the coast of Louisiana. And when the tanker ship, the Exxon Valdez, spilled in 1989. And they still have not paid the people who were suffered as a result of it. They're still in court. This is, decades later. Shows what a powerful company can do. So roughly around 100,000 barrels, and then, blackened the beaches, killed, around 4,000 seabirds and hundreds of other mammals. And it's one of the events that, helped lead to Earth Day. Some pictures, the most high-tech, oil absorbent at that time was hay, and so you see them just dumping hay bales all over the beaches of Santa Barbara. It's hard to imagine just all those beaches just covered in oil. Pretty disgusting. Gaylord Nelson, who kind of really pushed for Earth Day, said, let's all remember that the economy is a fully owned subsidiary of the environment and not the other way around. All economic activity is dependent upon the natural environment, and if you destroy the environment, you cannot have any GDP, GNP, or any other major economic development because it is totally dependent upon that. You have the first Earth Day that happens the next year in 1970. My wife, she wrote a poem for their Earth Day poetry reading thing, and she won. Was it second place? Yeah, she won second place. So, very proud of her for that. Came back and were taken over. Anyway, okay, moving on. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay. So you also see the emergence of one of the country's first environmental studies program. I don't think it is the first, but it's one of the first. And later on you get Bren Hall developed as sort of a symbol of that. Interesting thing, you have the Bren School of Science and Management, which is separate from the Environmental Studies program, which confuses a lot of people. But anyway, the Bren School started, founded and funded by Donald Bren, who is the richest person in Southern California, who also interestingly paved over most of Orange County, the land developer. So, he's done tremendous destruction to the environment. So but at least, he's funding this program to maybe figure out how to undo some of the damage or move forward or, whatever we need to do. And I was one time it was for an urban sociology class. I was talking about sewage and stuff, and looking up stuff for the lecture, and came across a site that was like top, 5 bathroom views in the world. Number 1 was this one in Bren Hall. So anyway, beautiful, beautiful view from the bathroom. Okay, as I said, offshore drilling takes off, and it really takes off. I mean, just over the last couple of decades, 1994, this is about as far as they're going. By 2010, you have, there's an enormous capability. And you also have in 2010, the BP oil spill. Don't know if you would remember that. If you do, you would have been pretty young. But again, BP. What is BP? The company originally known as British Petroleum. It's a British company. And they, as they noticed people, turning against climate change, turning against the fossil fuel industry, they started to talk about how they are going to, develop, new types of energy, and they will go beyond petroleum. And so they changed their name from British Petroleum to Beyond Petroleum. And they have this little flower here. All the oil and dead stuff, that's all that's all activist art over the actual logo. But they're still a petroleum company. They have not gone beyond petroleum. So anyway, they had this gigantic blowout, and it's estimated to be the largest marine oil spill in history. 11 people died, 11 oil workers. Almost 5 million barrels were opened. So we know that just in the last few years, along the coast of Louisiana, there's been more dolphin diseases. There's been fish without eyes. Just a lot of the stuff that we tend to see in environmental disasters. It was pretty disgusting. Now, it did not galvanize an environmental movement in Louisiana, like 1969 one did here in California. Why is that? Well, one, Louisiana's a more conservative state, but nobody likes huge oil spills. There's a big difference, though. The California Santa Barbara oil spill, Santa Barbara, it affects rich, powerful people. That's the main reason. But also, these are beaches that people go to that are accessible. The Louisiana coastline along the Gulf of Mexico isn't like that. Most of it is wetland. It goes pretty much from ocean into sort of different mangrove and other sort of wetland plants. So there's not, people don't have like their favorite beach that was covered in oil and stuff like that. So it's somewhat hidden from view. And the fisher, you would think, well, what about the fishers, the fishing industry? Well, a lot of the people who work doing fishing, they have 2 jobs. They work as fishers, but then they also work in the oil industry. So it's just a very, very different sort of culture. I was dismayed, though, to see that, the cleanup job the technology had not improved much. Other sociologists have pointed this out in other, oil spills that, weren't as bad as this one, that, not much has changed. That a lot of stuff has changed in terms of the technology, in terms of how to drill. If you go back to that slide that showed the different types of drilling, some of them were much, much deeper drilling than the others. So a lot of technological advancement there, nothing on the, on the cleanup end. Here they're using paper towels instead of straw. I don't know if that's any better or worse, actually. Now, it seems to pop up quite a bit. So again, Bill Freudenberg and his his co-author, Bob Gramling, they write the first book on the oil spill, the BP oil spill. And Bill Freudenberg dies shortly afterward, but he brings up this concept that, again, he had found earlier in his research, called what he calls the atrophy of vigilance. When individuals, corporations, and their governments reduce their regulatory surveillance of polluting industries. And basically, as time passes, people become less careful, both the people in the industry as well as the people who are supposed to be monitoring it. And then you tend to see these things happen again. So when I left California, I was living in, as I said, up in Sonoma County in Santa Rosa, but I was reading about the oil spill that had happened in up in Refugio. And this is the pipeline that burst open. I mean, look how corroded it is. And the scary thing is that there are pipes across this country that look like this, and that are piping oil and natural gas as well as water. And I think that's the really kind of frightening one, is that there are some water pipes that really, really need to be rebuilt. So estimated around 5,000 barrels were leaked. It killed a number of dolphin, as you can see there. And if you're familiar with the Refugio beach, got those kind of line of palm trees there. And you can see all the oil there. My wife, and before her health got really bad, but she worked for the Channel Island Restoration Project or whatever. They work out on the islands, but they also work on the coast too. And they were working to remove arundo cane, which is an invasive species of like bamboo that's like the evil twin of bamboo or something. That's very difficult to get rid of. But evidently, some of the stream that they were trying to preserve, gets all this oil in it and kills all this stuff that they had worked really hard to protect. These guys, I'm sure they're well intentioned. Getting oil out of Refugio Beach. They're not. This is not what you should do, though. They're not wearing any protective gloves or anything. This is highly toxic stuff, and you need to be prepared for that. So anyway, things that happen. So we're seeing now again opening up of oil. I believe oil drilling on the East Coast in certain places. So the leasing went from just 9 square miles to just about whatever the oil companies wanted. So this meant that you had thousands of leases that are sold. Average price was, $250 an acre, 6 times as much as land for oil companies. Now it brings in 30% less total income to the United States itself. Most of the income that comes from this offshore drilling is going to the oil companies. There are a lot of countries around the world that have offshore drilling, but they actually make sure that a lot of the income is going to the government itself, to the people, to pay for education and health care and things like this. So the U.S. total take then from oil, both underwater and above water, but focus on deep water now, is the lowest in the world. Roughly 40% goes to the public. Norway has 75% that goes to the public. So that's one reason Norway can fund its free education, its free, its various free healthcare and other programs. Problem that they're running into is that oil is starting to become depleted there as well. And so again, countries that are, I should say another thing that Norway was able to do, they were able to diversify their economy with the money that they made, not just become solely dependent upon them. as opposed to other many countries, Saudi Arabia and so on, that are become completely dependent on that one resource. And it's often, not necessarily because they want to, but because outside investors are pushing them to. Norway's a rich, wealthy country with their own investors and so on, so they don't have the same pressure, and they can withstand pressure that poorer countries with oil are not able to. So, for example, Vietnam, Angola, Kazakhstan, Brunei, all these countries do a lot of oil drilling, deep shore drilling, but 80% of the benefit goes to the public. For the U.S., we also have low tax rates. Oil companies are taxed at about 9%. Most businesses are taxed around 26%. Forget what it is. I think it was lowered under the Trump administration a bit. Maybe it's gone up again. I forget where we are in terms of why the tax cycle is, but anyway. So as I said, we're probably going to see a lot of drilling that's going on happen, probably, if we do drill, I should say. It's not foregone, but it's probably likely at some point. A lot of it will be on the eastern coast. Now, what's different about these areas than, say, along the coast of Louisiana and Texas here in Mississippi, is that there are a lot of nice beaches there. People actually, you have huge golf courses along them. You got a lot of beaches and things like that. So if there were drilling and it were to spill, it would be more like in California, the public response probably, than in Louisiana. Now, as I said, Pennsylvania, it's home to a lot of things. So when I moved there, I just became fascinated in that energy there, the energy industry. So you have a lot of fracking going on, and a lot of fracking innovation happening in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, in order to bring in companies, they didn't really tax a lot of the companies, and natural gas companies. Even Texas and Colorado had much higher what are they called, extraction taxes. So basically what that meant was you saw just a lot of drilling just take off. Blue dots are oil wells or some other type of gas. Red dots are this Marcellus oil, shale oil. Shale nitro. Jeez. Gas and natural gas and oil. So a lot just in 3 years. Then it keeps on going up until the burst. If you're interested in energy, highly recommend Gasland. There's also a Gasland too, but a guy from Pennsylvania, he looks at some of this stuff. I mean, there are places in Pennsylvania where there's so much natural gas in it from the fracking, it got into the groundwater sources, that you can actually, turn the tap on and light it on fire, and that's what some of the water looks like. And so, yeah, a lot of pollution, not just in Pennsylvania. It goes to Colorado, California, Colorado, Texas. I can't remember if it goes to California or not. So again, oil production takes off in the United States as a result of fracking, primarily. So fracking was the worst enemy for Vladimir Putin, because it meant that Russia would not be as powerful in terms of its oil as it had expected to. Basically, everyone thought that the U.S. would, its days of being a major oil producer were done. And the major oil powers would be Saudi Arabia and Russia and a few other places. But then fracking came, and that made the U.S. now the largest producer of oil, and that means that Russia's oil industry is not doing as well as they had expected to do. And of course, now with the war, who knows where it's going. I'm not going to go over this in a lot of information, but basically, even though the United States production was taking off, we were still bringing in, we were still importing a lot of oil because, the demand. We had a lot of demand during the sort of the long recovery from going from around 2010 till 2020, basically, kind of this 10-year recovery from the housing market and financial market crash last time. So again, it's important to recognize that even though the United States is now a major producer of oil, that we're already reaching that point of EROI, or we're coming close in some ways, energy return on investment. That's what laid waste to all these natural gas companies in North Dakota and Pennsylvania and other places when the markets crashed in 2020 because of COVID and demand crashed. So did these companies. So anyway, essentially, between 1998 and 2005, a certain amount was invested, and they found a certain amount of 8.6 million barrels. Between 2005 and 2013, they spent $4 trillion on exploration and production, and they only produced 4 million barrels per day, which was half as much as they were able to before. So again, peak oil is a real thing. I mean, we are not going to ever run out of every molecule of carbon dioxide and oil and everything. But we will run to a point. A point will come where we won't be able to afford it anymore. It will become too expensive. Oops. So anyway, yes. As I said, we'll never really get rid of everything physically, but we get to this point though, where we start to run out of resources. So 90% of the world's production, but then there's a certain limit of price or technology, and then we start having to use unconventional resources. So anyway, as I said, long before we get to that point, we'll already see a lot of disruption, as we already have by the gas prices going up. And I'm going to be very clear here that the gas prices, as much as they went up over these the last year or whatever, they really did not go up that much. I mean, we're likely to see them go up tremendously more in the future. So in 2009, a lot of our energy was coming from coal, then natural gas, then you had nuclear, hydroelectric, and then other, renewables at less than 5%. Things are slowly changing. One of the reasons that U.S. carbon emissions went down over the last 10, 15 years, is not because of solar energy or things like that, but rather that we've been replacing coal with natural gas. Now, natural gas releases methane, which is actually worse for the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. It doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long. So part of the shift away from coal includes natural gas. But again, there's a lot of natural gas, and it too is very, very polluting. It gets into water sources and all these different things. So we're starting to also see some interest in nuclear. Now, we'll talk about it later, but I'm a proponent of nuclear energy, particularly thorium-based nuclear energy that cannot actually be weaponized. I think it's the best way in which to have a less traumatic experience moving moving away from a fossil fuel-based economy. As I said, I'll talk about that in more detail later. Again, you can see coal use is just plummeting. It's not because of, well, whatever. But you see the power of the coal industry still with one senator from Virginia, Joe Manchin. If you follow politics at all, you'll know that he's been he's deeply buried in the coal industry, and he talks about protecting the coal jobs in West Virginia and so on and so forth. But again, the biggest threat to the coal industry is not, right, at least currently not, solar energy or things like that. It's natural gas. Natural gas has killed the coal industry. So coal, again, formed by ancient forests, covered by soil over time, compresses into mostly carbon. It is the world's largest source of electricity and the largest source of anthropogenic CO2 emissions. Since 1983, China has been the world's top coal producer. India, which in the coming months or years will soon surpass China as having the world's largest human population. It has huge amounts of coal that have never been used. Now, India is going to want to build a lot more refrigeration as well as air conditioning, and they're going to need energy for that, and they're probably going to use coal. Hopefully we can bring down the price of other things, and they won't have to dig up all that coal, but it's there, and it could push the plant. It could just make things even worse than they're already looking. So again, coal was found in America. One of the first places that it was found was in what's now Pennsylvania. One of the first mines was established near Pittston in Pennsylvania, so in these parts of Pennsylvania. And it rained. Coal was a sort of king. Coal was living in Pennsylvania until the 1950s, when it began to decline again. At this point, it was from coal production in other parts of the world, but then you're starting to see natural gas take off as well. Now, one of the ways in which a lot of coal has been found over time, there used to be these, drilling operations where you try and go down to the shaft, and the miners would have to go down in an elevator and bring up the coal. And then over time, and then you've got these other ways of drilling in over time. And then we get this, technology advances to the point that we figure out how to build machines that can destroy the tops of mountains and get to coal beds that are there. That may be hard to drill. So these are some of the largest machines used on Earth. They can move 2,000 cubic meters per hour. Pretty incredible. Yeah, to destroy a mountain, I guess it would have to be a pretty big machine. So it is left primarily West Virginia, the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia, looking less like mountains and more like flat land or something. So anyway, mountaintop removal still going on. A lot of people are turning against it. Now, very interested in this sociologist's book that's looking at sort of evolutionary approaches to understand kind of old sociological questions, essentially. Trying to figure out what is up with us, this insane primate that has the ability to destroy mountains and get coal from them. I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see that you can do the comparisons. CO2, natural gas has considerably less, and so that's why it's cleaner in some ways than coal is. But again, there's drilling for it. Again, drilling has to happen for everything. That goes for renewables as well. Some people say the the green energy economy begins in the mind, which is true. So again, we've been talking about energy and so on, and really, we're all stardust, right? It's energy that comes from a life from the past, essentially stored up sun power, and you have these different levels of it. So that's kind of where we're at right now. Though, as we know, our use of energy is a major contributor to the loss of life around the world. And this slide, as you can see, is focusing on the big mammals. They're just some of them the most visible. There are a lot of different things you can read, but I think it's important to understand, some behavioral biology, to understand sociobiology, things like this, evolutionary psychology, things that can help us understand why we do the things we do and how we are similar to other species and different, and what we can learn from those species. So Mama's Last Hug, Animal Emotions, and What They Tell Us About Ourselves, written by Frans de Waal, probably one of the top primatologists in the world. He's written a lot of books on various subjects. One most recently on gender, like gender from the view of a primatologist. It sounds kind of interesting. Another book that I'm a big fan of elephants. This book, Elephants on the Edge: What Animals Teach Us About Humanity. As a sociologist, I find elephants very interesting because they're a social organism and they do these sort of rituals, and they have this sort of rich culture that I find just very intriguing. And so this book, about every chapter is sort of a different elephant and kind of different circumstances, like a zoo or one that was raised at a conservation place in Kenya or something like this. And it's a tough read, though. I mean, because what it talks about is, elephants have a social structure that's matriarchal, and if the matriarch is killed, say, by a poacher or disease or something, you see sort of, there's a struggles for succession. The young bulls, males at the time, who are coming of age when the matriarch dies, will often become more aggressive and things like this. So anyway, it's a very, I thought it was just an eye-opening book, very, very fascinating. As someone who at one point wanted to be a psychotherapist, and I have a degree in psychology, this book covers a whole range of different topics. All right, so that is the end of my lecture on energy. Tomorrow I will be talking about we'll begin talking about the West, the movement out West. And on Wednesday, there will be a documentary, and I'll hopefully be able to do another lecture on Thursday. All right, everyone, I would suggest wearing your masks. COVID is still out there, but have a good day.